This video explains how to configure a Hyper-V host server in HostingController. Hyper-V host is the physical machine that hosts the virtual servers. It hosts the management OS and provides the resources, including CPU, memory, storage, and networking for virtual machines. In HostingController, a Hyper-V host can only be configured by the topmost admin, also known as the global admin. As the global admin is the one performing all control operations and cluster configurations, it is also the admin responsible for configuring a Hyper-V host machine in HostingController. Lower-level admins cannot configure a Hyper-V host machine. To configure a Hyper-V host, log into the control panel as the global admin. You will land on the dashboard. At the moment there is no server configured in the panel, therefore it will give you a no server configured message. Before adding a Hyper-V host machine to the panel, it's necessary to enable the Hyper-V service globally through cluster settings. Cluster settings allow you to define globally the various services and versions that would be available to the customers. The HostingController cluster will only offer those services that have been enabled for the cluster at the top. To configure cluster settings, navigate to the top right corner and click the Configurations cog. Then go to Cluster Settings. Here click the On-Premises tab and go to IaaS Computing. Enable the status checkbox and select Microsoft Hyper-V as the provider. Configure some other settings globally if required, such as a centralized repository and Hyper-V failover clustering. Then hit the Save button. Once Hyper-V has been defined globally, add its server to the cluster. To add a server, navigate back to the Configurations cog and hit Servers under Server Manager. Click the Add Server button and scroll down to the On-Premises Windows category. Click the category. Before adding the Hyper-V host to the control panel, make sure that the HC agent is installed on the Hyper-V host machine. To learn how to install an HC agent, see the link below. Give a friendly name to the Hyper-V host. Specify its IP address. Specify the admin user of the Hyper-V host. Provide the password for the administrator and check connectivity. The Check Connectivity button sends a WMI call to the Hyper-V host that establishes a connection between HostingController and the Hyper-V host. Failed connectivity prevents a valid connection from being established. To investigate a failed connection, you can always visit the logs. Now assign the IaaS computing role to the Hyper-V host. Assigning the IaaS computing role to it devotes it to the provisioning of Hyper-V virtual machines. Then hit the Add Server and Configure button. On the next screen, select Hyper-V as the provider and Hyper-V version 2 as the version. Provide the host name of the Hyper-V host. The host name is the name of the Hyper-V host machine. Specify the admin user of the Hyper-V host. Provide the password for the administrator and check connectivity. The Check Connectivity button again sends a WMI call to the Hyper-V host that establishes a connection between HostingController and the Hyper-V host. Once connected, select the virtual machine's root folder. This specifies the storage location of all virtual machines created by the HostingController. In other words, it's the location where all VHDX files are stored. The root path can also be selected on a mapped network drive. Then provide the network information. Select the virtual switch. Provide the preferred DNS. Provide the alternate DNS. Then specify archiving settings, if required. These settings are mainly required for archiving purposes. By default, when a virtual machine is deleted from Hyper-V Manager, it deletes the virtual machine from the list of the virtual machines, but the virtual hard disk file remains on the default storage path. In order to customize the behavior for better management, the VHDX file for the deleted machine can be moved to a designated folder. Later, if a customer asks to restore its deleted virtual machine, it can be done easily by restoring the virtual machine using the virtual hard disk file. Then specify the maximum available limits. These are the overall limits applied to the Hyper-V host. These limits represent the sum of all VMs on a single Hyper-V host. Enable bandwidth metering if required. HostingController supports both its own bandwidth meter and a third-party bandwidth metering tool by Host Tools. Bandwidth metering can also be enabled on all existing virtual machines on the Hyper-V host. Check the Enable checkbox to enable bandwidth metering on all existing virtual machines. Finally, hit the Save button. The Hyper-V host machine will be added to the panel. Next, see how to add an OS template. Try HostingController today.